You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics to culture and the arts.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in to another conversation with me, Nasim Ahmed, for the Middle East Monitor. Today, we have a really amazing guest, Zachary Foster, to discuss Zionism. Zachary is a historian of Palestine. He has a PhD from Princeton University. Many of you will have probably seen him on X. He's quite active. His threads, I would say, are full of gems, many analysis that debunks founding claims of Israel and Zionism. So I'm really pleased to have Zachary on the show. Zachary, welcome to the MEMO conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's dive in straight away, Zachary, and turn to an interview that was given last week, I think, by Yuval Noah Harari, a prominent Israeli philosopher, thinker. And he was really answering in one of the segments, answering what is Zionism. And in the view of Harari, he says that when I hear people compare Zionism with racism, this in itself is a racist statement, according to Harari. And in his eyes, Zionism is simply the national movement of the Jewish people. What would you say to that?
Well, Zionism was a political ideology that was first developed among Christians in the 16th century, later embraced by Jews in the mid to late 19th century, that said we should establish a Jewish state in a country that's 90% non-Jewish. And if you just ask yourself, if you put yourself in the shoes of that 90% of Palestine, the Palestinian Arabs who were non-Jewish, if you put yourself in their shoes and ask yourself, if there was a movement of foreigners, primarily Europeans, who sought to move to your country, buy your land, evict you from it because you're the wrong religion, and then refuse to hire you because you're also the wrong religion, with the ultimate goal of subjecting you to the political rule of that foreign settler community, would you think that's racist? I mean, in the United States, for example, you can't discriminate based on race or religion when you're hiring someone in a business or in a company. But that was precisely the core of the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement said, hire only Jews. The Zionist movement, this was a concept known as Hebrew labor. The idea was, in order to build a Jewish state, in order to transform the Jew, the new Jew, the muscular Jew, the strong Jew, who's not living in exile, who's not subject to European discrimination and anti-Semitism. It's a new Jew who's in control of his own or her own destiny. We need to till the soil. We need to remove the Arabs who are living on the land that we buy, in order to become the farmers ourselves. And that is exactly what led to violence in the first 2 to 3 decades of the Zionist movement. You have Zionists buying up land, primarily from absentee landlords living in Beirut, Sidon, Haifa, Jerusalem, Jaffa. They buy the land. There's Palestinian farmers living on it. And in order for them to achieve the Zionist dream, they have to evict the Arabs living there because they're of the wrong religion. Okay? So, I mean, I don't know what other word to describe this phenomenon. I don't know what better word to use.
It seems to be, Hariri, like many others, it seems to be kind of a gotcha question. If you believe, Arabs have a right to self-determination, if you believe Bengalis have a right to self-determination, Pakistanis have a right to self-determination, why should you deny Jews the right to self-determination? And that seems to be a kind of a gotcha question without really discussing the next step. Okay, what does that then mean in reality when the rubber hits the road, when you really try and implement that idea in Palestine? It's not the same as Bangladeshi self-determination or Palestinian self-determination or the French self-determination. It's something different, and they don't want to own up to that fact. So am I right in saying that this really got your question without really going to the heart of the issue, which is that if you implement Zionism, if Zionism was implemented in Mars or in a completely barren land, it's probably fine, but it seems to be a fundamental problem with that argument, isn't there?
You're exactly correct. In a world where Palestine is uninhabited, where it's a barren wasteland, waiting for inhabitants to make the deserts bloom and to drain the swamps, right? If it was barren and uninhabited, which, by the way, many European Zionists thought, they didn't even know it was inhabited. But if you're right, if there's no one living there and you want to create an exclusively Jewish state, and somehow you figure out a way of making sure no non-Jews enter the state, then I suppose it doesn't have to, in theory, be racist. But again, that ignores the actual history of the Zionist movement. If you want to live as a philosopher and imagine, what ifs? What if we establish a Jewish colony on Mars? What if we establish a Jewish colony in Antarctica? What if we build an island for the purpose of exclusive Jewish settlement? Again, you can live in a fantasy world. You can invent historical fiction. But as far as I know, Yuval Harari claims to be a historian. And if you're a historian, you have to study history. You don't get to invent history that you wish had happened. That's not how history works.
So Zionism was, of course, a minority movement within Judaism. So what were the key arguments when it was first presented to the Jews, and who were the key opposition against Zionism?
So the proponents of Zionism stem primarily from the bourgeois, the European Jewish capitalist class. So the intellectuals, the petty bourgeoisie, people like Theodor Herzl, people like Max Nordau. They were journalists, they were writers, playwrights. And by the way, most of them had no desire to move to Palestine themselves. Herzl and Nordau saw themselves as German and Austrian, and that they believed Germans were, before they embraced Zionism, they embraced a kind of a German nationalism where they saw Germans as the, kind of sort of the highest culture, of the highest kind of breed, right? This was also kind of racially impregnated with these ideas of kind of racial superiority over other groups, over other nations, over other peoples. And in fact, that's why the Bund, which was the largest Jewish party in the Pale settlement of the Russian Empire, they were originally quite hostile to Zionism because they saw this petty bourgeoisie movement undermining a class solidarity. And so you had, for example, Herzl go meet with the Tsar of Russia in 1903, the same Tsar of Russia who, by the way, had hoped to exterminate all the Jews of Russia, but he realized he couldn't do that. So instead he said, well, I can't carry out a genocide against the Jews of the Russian Empire. The world won't let me do that. But I can support Zionism because that's a backdoor. That's an alternative approach to ridding the Russian Empire of those filthy, dirty Jews. And in fact, and that's why the Bund were enraged with Herzl for visiting the Russians and for telling the Russian Empire, we will undercut and undermine the Jewish communists. Who are these revolutionaries who wanted class equality, who wanted to overthrow the Russian monarchy. We will undercut them and undermine them, and we will prevent them from raising their voice. So Herzl allied himself with the anti-Semites in Russia. And the same was true in places like Hungary, where Istotsky, who was the leader of the anti-Semitic movement in Hungary, he also was a raging Zionist and proposed in 1878 before the Hungarian parliament that we send all the Hungarian Jews to Palestine. So you could say he was a kind of a Zionist before there were very many Jewish Zionists to speak of. You had many other anti-Zionists across Eastern and Western Europe. You obviously had the religious anti-Zionists who said that this movement, this secular movement of Jews who were telling you didn't need to observe the laws and the commandments, you didn't need to worry about halakha, Jewish law. Instead, what you need to do was basically move to Palestine and build a Jewish national homeland in Palestine. The religious Jews said, well, we've seen this before. Shabtai Tzvi in the 7th century tried telling us to move to Palestine as well, and that was a heresy because in traditional Jewish law, in halakha, only God decides when Jews should move to Palestine, right? Because Jews basically have these eschatological fantasies, just like Christians and Muslims, that in the end of days, all the Jews will ingather in the Holy Land, and this will bring about the second coming of the Messiah. But of course, only God can decide when that happens, and any human action taken to try and hasten the second coming of the Messiah, to try and pull that forward future, that's a heresy, and that should be condemned. And so you have many Jewish leaders in Palestine. The head, the chief rabbi of Ottoman Palestine, Zonderfield, he was hostile to Zionism and published tracts against it in the early 20th century. The same was true of many European Jewish authorities who said this is a heresy, not just because it's a violation of this specific Torah commandment that says God decides when the second coming of the Messiah will happen, not humans, but also because Zionist leaders are telling you Jewish law doesn't matter. You don't need to pray 3 times a day. You don't need to keep kosher or keep the Sabbath, right? Instead, what you need to do is you need to believe that Jewish redemption will come through human action. You need to move to Palestine. You need to support the Zionist movement. All of those things have nothing to do with Jewish law. They have nothing to do with halakha. And so, for those reasons, Judaism, Jewish leaders, for the most part, oppose Zionism. And by the way, that's a trend. A movement within Orthodox Judaism that continues to the present day, right? You have 100,000 Satmar Hasidim who reject Zionism. You have 10,000 Neturei Karta Hasidim who reject Zionism and are some of the most vocal anti-Zionist Jews around. You have many tens of thousands of Jews living in the state of Israel who refuse to wave an Israeli flag, who do not pay taxes to the Israeli government, and they do not recognize this government as a legitimate authority because, again, it's not about Jewish law. It's not about Jewish practice. It's not about Jewish observance. It's secular symbols, secular flag, secular ideology. So again, these are some of the main reasons that Jews oppose Zionism. And if I could just mention one other trend within. Actually, 2 other trends within within the anti-Zionist Jewish movement. The first, I would say, is a kind of assimilationist view. And this, I would say, is actually the most important of all or let's say the largest of all the anti-Zionist Jewish groups. They said, look, this was the case with the American Reform Jews well into the 1930s, starting with the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885, the foundational document of American Reform Judaism, which is the largest branch of American Judaism today. They said, we have no desire to move to Palestine. We want to become American just like any other American. Why are you trying to associate us with this foreign movement? We're going to be accused of having dual loyalties, and that's going to make it harder for us to assimilate into American society, which is our ultimate goal. And so then you have 299 American prominent Jewish leaders in the aftermath of the Balfour Declaration say, we want to have nothing to do with this movement. Please do not associate us with Zionists. As late as the early 1930s, 1% of American Jews were members of the Zionist Organization of America, about a few tens of thousands at a time when you had millions of Jews in the United States. So you could say the assimilationist Jews who were prominent in the United States, in the UK. Morgenthau, the only Jewish member of the British cabinet in 1917, when the British embraced the Balfour Declaration, he was the only member of that cabinet who said, no, this is a terrible idea. This is going to threaten the status of Jews everywhere in the world. And then just the final point I would make here is you had also a humanitarian view. This was a minority view. I won't deny that, but you had many Jews. I would say Morris Jastrow Jr. is, in my opinion, the most insightful of them all, who was a historian. And in 1919, he was an American-Polish historian. He wrote, you cannot create a state in Palestine based around just a single nationality, because you have Muslims living in Palestine, you have Christians living in Palestine. And so obviously, if you try and create a Jewish state in a land that is overwhelmingly non-Jewish, you're going to discriminate against all those non-Jews. And that view was expressed in 1919. And here we are, 140 years later, living with the consequences of having a Jewish state in a land that is mostly non-Jewish.
One of the pushbacks against Zionism, from what I read, was that Zionism essentially was trying to remake Judaism, remake what it means to be a Jew, and redefine Jewish identity. So I wanted to share a quote from Theodor Herzl, who is the founder of, well, one of the founders of Zionism. He said, I will give you my definition of a nation, and you can add the adjective Jewish. And a nation, says Herzl, is in my mind an historical group of men of recognizable cohesion held together by common enemy. So the key word here is held together by common enemy. Then, if you add to that the word Jewish, you have what I understand to be a Jewish nation. Why is this definition of a Jew problematic in your point of view? I mean, I could give my thoughts, but I'd like to really hear why you think this is so problematic.
It's worth stating that nations, ethnicities, religions, these are invented. They do not exist in nature. I cannot ask you to take a DNA test and determine whether you're Muslim or Christian or Jewish or Polish or Hungarian or Israeli or Palestinian, right? We just made up those ideas. They don't exist in nature. They exist in our minds. So even the idea of talking about Jews are not a religion, but they are a nation, requires you to believe a fiction, requires you to imagine that, these categories that we made up are real. No, they're not real. There's no such thing as a nation. We just invented it. So Jews, for many, many centuries, especially Zionist Jews, have been hell-bent on trying to convince you that Jews are, in fact, a nation. Right. So, by the way, all nationalists do this. There's nothing special about Jewish nationalists, right? The Polish nationalists would tell you, the Kosovar nationalists, the Serbian nationalists will tell, the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, the Serbian nation goes back millennia, right? And the same is true in France, right? They will tell you you'll go back to the 15th century. They'll cite you, a French battle. Our nation goes back to antiquity. The Greeks will do the same, obviously, and the same is true in Mexico. They will do this everywhere. They will tell you our nation is ancient and we're a cohesive ethnic core, but this is all a fiction, okay? Because guess what? If you're non-Jewish, you can convert to Judaism, right? And by the way, in Jewish history, there have been mass conversion events. So this idea that we're all of the same, we all share a same kind of genetic makeup. By the way, guess who also believed that? Adolf Hitler, right? This idea that nations are rooted in blood and soil, and this is a myth that was invented in the 19th century and became popular in Nazi and fascist Europe. Based on this belief that nations are kind of derived from these kind of ethnic cores, and you're either a German or you're not, and if you're not a German, you're an Übermenschen, right? These are very problematic ideas and have led to some of the most violent episodes in all of human history. So I don't know why people like Herzl, well, we know why, right? Because they were raised in this environment where racial anti-Semitism was heyday, right? They internalized some of these stereotypes about Jews, that they were in fact kind of a race, a nation. And that's why, by the way, many of the earliest Zionists believed in the idea of racial purity. Arthur Rupin, right, who was the head of the political office in Palestine during the first decade and a half of the 20th century, call him the Ben Gurion before Ben Gurion. He didn't want Ethiopian Jews to migrate to Palestine because they would taint Jewish blood. I mean, that was the attitude. Zev Jabotinsky had similar views, right? That Jews are this pure race and we don't want to be tainted by non-Jews. I mean, doesn't that sound awfully similar to what the Nazis said?
It does. But this also has real life ramifications. If you believe your definition of, say, Jew is, or the Jewish nation is a nation that's held together by a common enemy, then what does that say? What if there isn't a common enemy? What if there isn't any anti-Semite? Does that mean there isn't a Jew or a Jewish nation? What does it really mean? So if you accept Herzl's position or his view about what a Jewish nation is, then you need a constant supply of enemies to continue the creation and the maintenance of Israel. Without that, then there is no Israel. So I look at that and I say, okay, if you look at Israel since its founding, it's been fighting with everyone, from the secular PLO, from the Christian Palestinian resistance groups, to the Palestinian Muslims, to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to Iran, to Iraq, to all its neighbors. There's a reason why it's fighting, because ultimately, if you believe Herzl, then you have to accept the fact that Israel needs a constant supply of enemies to remain a cohesive nation. Without that, then there is no state of Israel. That's what Herzl seemed to be saying, but reducing an ancient group of people, a religion, to a nation that's held together by enemies. And I think it's such a, if people understood that, then they understand why Israel is constantly at war with its neighbors. Just want to get your thoughts on that.
Well, it doesn't sound all that different from what most political leaders, demagogues, populists, what tactics that they have employed in history in order to rile up support from their base, in order to get people to stand behind them. This is a tried and true tactic. If you want to convince Germans in the 1930s why it is that their economy has been suffering so much since the end of World War II, since the end of World War I. Well, what do? You blame the Jews. They're the scapegoat, right? They're the reason. They're the financiers. They're the leeches. They're the ones who are stripping you of your dignity. And that was the argument that was used by the Nazis to otherize the Jews and make them the enemy of the state, the enemy of the nation. So when Herzl says that, these people are we define ourselves in opposition to these other people, this just sounds a lot to me like the classic kind of demagogy and incitement to racism that you see not just in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, but also in the United States in 2024 when you have J.D. Vance, a vice presidential candidate to Donald Trump, talk about the Haitians, taking our jobs and, eating dogs and cats. I mean, this sounds a lot similar to me, right? It's this idea that in order for me to strengthen my authority, to build my base, to bring my base out to vote, well, I need to inspire, I need to explain that the reason inflation is as high as it is. The reason why unemployment is on the rise. The reason why that you can't afford your health care. The reason why you can't pay rent is because of those Haitians, those Muslims, those Arabs, and the Zionists employed the exact same tactics.
I know you're also a historian of the Middle East, and you know a lot about the region. So I wanted to get your thoughts on another one of Israel's propaganda lines, which is that Jews have been persecuted all over the world, and therefore we need the state of Israel to preserve Jewish existence. They basically take the history of Jews in Europe and transplant that onto the Middle East, as though Jews in the Middle East suffered same kind of pogroms and genocidal campaigns like in Germany under Hitler, and that's just, to my reading, it's just completely false. I mean, what do you say to that when they try and present this case that Jews have been persecuted everywhere and therefore they need this state to preserve and protect themselves and continue as a cohesive nation?
Well, the people who tell you this don't have a very sound understanding of Zionist history, because during the first 3 decades of the Zionist movement, roughly from the early 1880s, until actually well into the 1920s and perhaps beyond, the Zionist leaders in Palestine, we mentioned Arthur Rupin, but there were others as well. They actually had a fairly strict policy around which Jews were allowed to migrate to Palestine, right? Because they would be basically placed in one of these agricultural colonies. And so it was an organized movement. It wasn't just any Jew would just show up to Palestine and settle in one of these agricultural colonies. That's not how it worked. You would apply in your home country and you would either be accepted or you would be rejected by the Palestine office, which was led by Arthur Rupin. And there was a study that recently came out a couple of years ago in which they went through the records of the Palestine office to try and figure out who was accepted and who was rejected. And they determined that between 60 to 80%, so about 61% of the Jews who were applying to move to Palestine were rejected. And then another 20% were basically told they were not given an explicit green light, but they were not rejected. So between 60 to 80% were either kind of put on ice or rejected explicitly. Why? Do you know what the number one reason for the rejection was?
What was it?
Those Jews were too destitute. Okay? So here you are telling me that Zionism is all about bringing Jews, saving Jews from impoverishment and persecution and destitution. Those Jews in Ukraine who were slaughtered in the thousands, who tried moving to Palestine. Well, guess what? They were rejected for the reason that they didn't have enough capital to bring with them. to Palestine, because the Arthur Rupin and the Zionist community in Palestine, they didn't want destitute Jews. They didn't want large families with little kids that needed taken care of. They weren't trying to save Jews. They were trying to build a Jewish homeland. Well, how do you build a Jewish homeland? You need strong Jews with capital to invest in the communities, right? Who are single, who don't have dependents, who are needy, who are sick. In fact, in the 1920s, the main reason for rejection was because they were sick. Right, they were diseased, or they wanted healthy Jews. They didn't want to bring Jews who were who had been impoverished and displaced and lost their livelihoods. Those were the last Jews they wanted to bring to Palestine. The same was true in the 1930s, by the way. In 1939. There was this obviously you have the rise of Hitler in Nazi Germany in 1933. And of course, Jews around the world are horrified by the rise of Hitler. This is obviously a major threat, not just to the Jews of Germany, but to all Jews in Europe are horrified by this. And so you get this spontaneous boycott of Nazi products. But actually, it's the Zionists who say, wait a minute, hold on. Nazism isn't all that bad, because the Nazis and the Jew and the Zionists have the same shared goal of ridding Germany of the Jews. Obviously, the Germans, Nazis, they didn't care where the Jews wound up, but the Zionists wanted them all to go to Palestine. And there was one particular episode during the Kindertransport. This is in 1939, when just after Kristallnacht, right, there's this pogrom, this infamous pogrom against the Jews of Germany, where their shops are destroyed. Thousands of Jews Jewish businesses are destroyed. Attacks on Jewish homes. Many Jews are injured and are killed. But so this is a horrific episode of violence. And as after this episode of violence, you get the British government agree to allow 10,000 Jewish children it's called Kindertransport. Basically, the 10,000 Jewish children are permitted to flee Nazi Germany and move to Great Britain. And in response to that episode, Ben-Gurion tells the Zionist executive in Palestine, and this is well documented. There's no historians dispute this. He says, if I could save all the Jewish children of Germany and send them to Great Britain, or if I could just save half of them, but the half that I'm able to save come to Palestine, I'm going to choose the latter. I'm going to choose just saving half, because in the name of creating a Jewish state, well, it's worth killing half the Jews of Germany. Right, so this attitude was not about saving Jews. That was always secondary. Sure, great, if we can save Jews fleeing persecution, wonderful, but that's not the goal of Zionism. Don't be mistaken for a minute. The goal of Zionism is to build a Jewish state. How do you build a Jewish state? Actually involves a lot of, Jewish death, right? Jews need to put their lives on the line, especially when you're talking about building a Jewish state in a land that is overwhelmingly non-Jewish. That involves a lot of Jewish suffering, right? Because ethnic cleansing is a dirty business, obviously for the people being ethnically cleansed, but also for the people doing the ethnic cleansing, which is why in the 1948 war, 6,000 Jews perished. 1% of the Zionist community living in Palestine perished during that war, because carrying out all of these ethnic cleansing operations, expelling tens of thousands of Jews from Lid, massacring expelling tens of thousands of Palestinians from Lid, massacring hundreds of Palestinians in Tantura, in Deir Yassin, in the north, right? This was a dirty business and involved a lot of Jewish suffering. And this is really the history of Zionism, right? It's put Jews on the front lines, use Jewish civilians as a first line of defense, as human shields. And in fact, if you look at the Gaza envelope, right, the communities that were attacked on October 7th, Be'eri, Re'im, Kfar Aza, all of these communities, right? And if you look at the history of those communities, there's a dirty little secret about all of them. I just wrote a piece about this. They were all built in exactly the same way. The goal of those settlements was to put Jewish civilians on the front lines of the territorial community of the Jewish state to act as a first line of defense, to die in the event of, to defend the Zionist community and of course, sacrifice one's life in the name of Zionism, defending the Jewish state, expanding the borders of the Zionist community. That was the case with literally all of those communities. And by the way, the same is true in the north. It's not just the south, it's all the border communities. Why are there so many Israeli communities, by the way, on the Lebanese border as well? Same story, right? It's put Jews on the front lines. Civilians who are then, buttressed by soldiers, right? Civilian soldiers are kind of, it's sort of two sides of the same coin, right? You need to settle the land to create facts on the ground, but then you need to send the Haganah troops there. And then, of course, afterwards, the Israeli military there to defend those civilian settlements. And you have one anecdote. There's a 1970 film made about some of these settlements on the Gaza envelope. And there's this anecdote where one of the participants in 1943 who established Be'eri, one of the communities hit hardest on October 7th. He's interviewed and he's asked, how did you guys establish Be'eri in 1943? The documentary came out in the 1970s. And he says, in the 1948 war, when the Egyptian forces were advancing, we had the Haganah embedded in our civilian community, and there was no difference between a civilian and a fighter. We all did the same thing. We slept in the same barracks. We shared the same food. We picked up weapons together. Right? They were bragging about civilians being embedded with the Zionist militias. This was a point of pride for them. Right? So the whole Zionist enterprise is putting Jewish civilians in harm's way. And I mean, to pretend as if Zionism is somehow in the interest of the Jewish people today, to pretend as if, you've had 10,000, according to a December 2023 report that came out of Israeli trauma centers, more than 10,000 Israeli soldiers, obviously the vast majority of whom are Jewish, have been injured in the war already. That was almost a year ago, before the fighting had peaked in many areas. Is that figure 20,000 today? Is it 30,000 Jews maimed and wounded in order to carry out this genocidal war? That's in the interest of the Jews. You're safeguarding Jews by sending Jews off to die?
So two things to that. When people generally, even supporters of Israel, they would condemn Israel for expanding its settlements into the West Bank. They call them illegal settlements. But forgetting the fact that that was exactly how Israel was created to begin with. Israel was putting lives of Jews at risk by expanding settlements in what is now Israel. But what Israel is doing in the West Bank is exactly what it was doing in historic Palestine by building these settlements, putting the lives of Jewish settlers at risk for the purpose of expanding the state. So, and I think October 7, if it hasn't confirmed already, it's confirmed that Jews are, if anything, more unsafe in Israel than anywhere else in the world. So this whole idea that Israel exists for the protection and preservation of Jews is completely goes out the window, which is why I couldn't understand why Biden made the statement he did when he said that without Israel, talking to a community of Jews, without Israel, you would not be safe. I mean, what does he mean by that? As a president, you should be protecting all your citizens, Jews, Muslims, everyone. So it doesn't make any sense to me. So what we've said so far, I mean, it sounds like Zionism is one of those many bad ideas. And generally, if you look at history, bad ideas have a shelf life. The communities slowly but surely spit out bad ideas. If I was to give an example, I'm not saying they're the same, but, ISIS was a bad idea, what they came with, and the people rejected the idea. Despite its extreme violence and atrocities, people rejected the idea. People spat that idea out because it did not provide real-life answers to the problems of the population they were governing over. And that seems to be the case with Israel as well. It's not providing an answer to the lives of 12 million people who are living there. Yes, it's an answer to some of the people, Jews who are living citizens of Israel, but it's not an answer to the non-Jews who are also living in historic Palestine. So do you think after what's happened since October 7 with the genocide and what we're seeing now, do you think we're coming at a moment where Zionism is being seen as a bad idea within the Jewish communities, and we will see a snowballing of resistance to Zionism to say, look, this idea cannot last. It will only create a cycle of violence, death, and destruction. And the only way to preserve this is through ongoing genocide and violence.
I think that for many decades, Jews didn't think twice about Zionism. For most Jews in the United States and elsewhere abroad, Zionism was almost taken for granted. It was almost such an obviously a good idea that they didn't think twice about it. But I think over the past few decades, really, especially I would say since 2000, since the failure of Oslo, since it became obvious that there's never going to be a Palestinian state, that even the most liberal, the most left-wing Zionists had no intention of giving Palestinians real self-determination. I think ever since that failure has become obvious and impossible to deny, Zionism has been retreating among American Jews. You recall the essay that Peter Beinart wrote, was it already 2011, 2012, The Crisis in Zionism? It was a book, I believe, in which he's describing how when asked to check their, so you have all these American Jews who are very liberal, right? Among some of the most liberal, progressive Americans you'll find. But the problem was that Zionism just didn't vibe with their progressive ideas around, equal rights and rule of law and, a freedom of speech. And, because why? Because Israel, over the past 2 decades, has become more right-wing. It has become more fascist. And the occupation has only intensified. The apartheid regime has only solidified. And at a point where you have every single major human rights organization in the world, including the UN, including Human Rights Watch, including Amnesty International, including Al-Haq, including B'Tselem, including every relevant human rights organization in the world, coming to the same conclusion that between the river and the sea, there's a single state with a single prime minister, with a single cabinet, and a single military. But between the river and the sea, there are different categories of human beings who have different rights. There are different legal systems for different types of human beings. And these aren't equal. These aren't like, separate but equal systems. No, these are separate but very, very unequal systems. If you're a Palestinian in the West Bank, if you're a Palestinian in Hebron, and you are arrested, you can be imprisoned indefinitely without having been charged with a crime. You committed a crime in the future. That is what you're being charged with. But Israelis are not subject to that same legal treatment known as administrative detention. So you have a Palestinian living in one house in Hebron, and across the street, literally across the street, you have an Israeli living in Hebron. And the Israeli is not subject to administrative detention. And when the Israeli is arrested, he or she must be brought before a judge within 24 hours. But when the Palestinian is arrested, they can be detained indefinitely forever without being charged with the crime. And they must be brought before a judge, not within 24 hours, but within 192 hours. Different legal systems for different categories of human beings, Jews, and the Übermenschen, the Palestinians, right? So this is the logic of Israeli apartheid. And it's why every human rights organization is calling it apartheid, which is why American Jews have increasingly woken up to this reality. In 2022, you had a poll in which almost 30%, maybe 25% of millennial Jews, so these are Jews, let's say under 35, under 40, 25% of American Jews described Israel as an apartheid state. Okay, now the percentage must be dramatically higher. I don't know the polling on genocide, but if you just limit yourself to Democrats, and obviously most Jews are Democrats, the polling among Democrats is that I think the most recent poll I saw was it 60% of Democrats describe Israel's actions in Gaza as a genocide? Yeah. So, I mean, and Jews would say the same thing. If anything, Jews represent the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, right? So Jews are waking up to the realization after 2 decades after many, many decades of an intensifying and expanding, Israeli control over Palestinians, where there's simply no hope of Palestinians ever achieving self-determination. And the occupation only goes in one direction: more apartheid roads, more land confiscation, more destruction of Palestinian olive groves, more settlers in the West Bank, more ethnic cleansing operations in Khumsa, in the north, in the south, in the South Hebron Hills, right, in the E1 zone, in Khan al-Ahmar, wherever you go in the West Bank, in Beitah, where they're reestablishing the settlement that was evacuated in 2005. Wherever you go in the West Bank, Palestinians are being pushed into smaller and smaller areas, call them Bantustans if you like, which is, by the way, the reason why Ariel Sharon, when he was prime minister in 2002, his one of his main advisors was an expert on South Africa. And there are these anecdotes where Ariel Sharon would be obsessed with asking this guy questions. How did they manage the Bantustans? What were the best practices? Why did Ariel Sharon obsess over that? Because he realized that was exactly what Israel was doing in the West Bank. And this is exactly why you have dozens of Israeli leaders who have said it outright, who have said Israel is becoming an apartheid state. Israel will eventually become an apartheid state. They like to use the future tense, but they're obviously all well aware that this is an apartheid state. And why would an American Jew support this?
I think you touched on a really important point there. I mean, of course, we know that within the progressive constituencies, opposition to Israel is very deep and strong for ideological reasons. But also, there's a phenomenon on the right, which is that, even the mega communities, they look at Israel and see Israel as draining on American resource, and they're really opposed to US continue to fund Israel. Of course, that's not had any political ramification, but you can see that reaching a point where it will have an impact on politics because there's more and more, even on the right wing, for their own reasons, some are racist. They're saying that Israel is just a drain on US resource. So I think, point you're making is true. There's opposition to Israel from all corners, and not to mention the fact that within the region itself, the region is realizing, do we really want to have a political project which requires maintenance through extreme violence every few years? Is that something that's sustainable? And that's not to say, Palestine, there was no Jews in Palestine. Jews have always been in Palestine. What kind of political formula do we have to maintain peace and protect the rights of Jews, Muslims, and Christians, and everyone else that lives in Palestine? That's the formula that needs to be found. And that question is being asked not just by people like you and me, but others as well, who are now, after the events of the past year, they look at Israel and say, okay, this cannot go on anymore. And that's coming for various reasons, coming from all corners of the US and the UK and elsewhere, of course, as well. Zachary, I don't know if you want to add anything to this, but I want to give you another few minutes to speak, to say, just to speak about your course. I know you're running in November 4 or 5 lecture series. I'm definitely going to be signing up to that. And as I said, Zachary's tweets are a gem. So tell us about that and how people can join your course in November.
I'm launching a course called Zionism 101. We're going to cover the origins of the Zionist movement in the 16th century among Protestant Christians in England. We're going to obviously focus on the period beginning when Jews started to embrace Zionism, which was beginning in the late 19th century. We'll do that in 4 lectures and then a Q&A. And then, everyone who signs up for the course will have access to the slides, which are fully sourced. I think the first lecture is in early November. I forget the exact date.
First week of November. It's on Wednesdays. Every Wednesdays, I know.
That's right. But of course, we'll do the lectures live. But if you can't make the live lectures, no worries. We'll record them all, and you'll get a link sent shortly after the lecture is delivered, and so you can watch it asynchronously at your own pace as you like. And so you can sign up for that course at PalestineNexus.com.
I'll make sure to put the link below in our video as well. So Zachary, thank you so much for joining us. It's been really fantastic having you on MEMO Conversation. And thank you for tuning and listening. See you for another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Bye-bye.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.